Okay. Welcome, everyone. All right. We are going to begin right now. Thank you for waiting while we waited for the room to fill up, the virtual room. My name is Christina, and I am Factory Media Center's Operations Coordinator. Before we begin tonight, I would like to take the time to acknowledge that the land of present-day Hamilton is situated on the shared ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes and preserve them for years to come. As a not-for-profit artist-run center, the factory is committed to active, ongoing reconciliation in collaboration with Indigenous peoples in our community. If you are also interested in getting involved with this work, please check out what's currently going on at 1492 Landback Lane, about 20 minutes away from Hamilton. The land defenders there are currently defending treaty land from developers and are collecting donations to help towards funds and occasionally also ask for donations of supplies. We'll paste the donation link in the description if you would like to learn more. Also, if you haven't heard of Factory Media Center, we are a media arts resource center in Hamilton, Ontario, and host exhibitions, screenings, provide multimedia equipment, studio space, and skill development workshops for local artists and independent filmmakers, including anyone interested in digital media. Before we begin the event tonight, I would like to thank our funders, the Insight Foundation for the Arts, City of Hamilton, Ontario Arts Council, Canada Council for the Arts. Thank you for making our programs possible. Finally, an event like this is only able to be done because of the help of the amazing people who support FMC directly. And I want to give a big thank you to Jessica Rodriguez for your ongoing live stream support in our past programs and tonight's as well. Now, we are all gathered here tonight to welcome Stephanie Deumer. Stephanie is a visual artist currently living and working in Los Angeles, California. She completed a BA at the University of Guelph in 2011 and an MFA at California Institute of the Arts in 2015. From 2018 to 19, she was a fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. And she's also the recipient of a 2019 Research and Creation Grant from the Canada Arts Council, as well as a 2018 Bar Fund LA Artist Grant. In addition to exhibitions at Modern Fuel, College of the Canyons, and PAVED Arts, Stephanie is also the current Factory Media Center and now remote artist in residence. So before we pass the stage off to Stephanie tonight, please feel free to write any comments and questions in the chat at any point, and we will pass them along to Stephanie at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Stephanie. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to start just by thanking Factory Media Center for the opportunity to have a residency, a remote residency. It was so wonderful to have the time and the support to dedicate towards a new project. And thank you to Christina for being the liaison, for supporting me as well, and for Jessica for helping with all the tech support today too. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So I wanted to take this time today to, rather than do a straightforward artist talk about my work, I wanted to focus on one facet or one line of research from a previous film of mine, so not the current project I was working on at Factory Media Center. And that was this is a film called Spooky Action at a Distance. And hopefully after I talk about this, I will have time at the end to discuss my newer project and also to open it up to questions as well. But the sort of line of research I wanted to focus on was the history, or is the history of early projection and film technology, and how it is related to current artificial intelligence and virtual assistants like Siri and Alexa, for example. So this, what you're seeing on the screen, is just a still from that film. And I'm going to enter talking about the research behind that film with this image, and talking about early projection technology, specifically something called the magic lantern. And I hope that everyone can see my cursor on the screen, but I'm just circling here what a magic lantern is in this picture. And it's basically an image projector and a precursor to a motion picture projector. So it was essentially a light lantern that you would put a glass slide into, and the glass slide would have an image on it. Usually it's kind of a painting or something like that, that would project this image. And it was invented in the 17th century, but it became used quite predominantly in the mid to late 1800s in something called phantasmagoria, which was this Victorian sort of illusion show. It was a sort of horror theater, or like a dark magic show, where they would make these ghosts appear on stage. This example that you see is more of just a light that's projected on an actual figure, an actual actor. And then they use these sort of reflections using glass in the theater and some mirrors to create basically a sort of hologram or holograph on stage of a sort of ghost image, to create a fright in the crowd. And so sometimes it was an actual actor that was projected, and sort of the image would bounce off of these different glasses and reflections onto the stage. And sometimes it was, as I mentioned before, this sort of image, slide image inside of the magic lantern. And so I wanted to show some examples of the magic lanterns because I think they're pretty fantastic objects in and of themselves. They're these sort of highly decorative boxes. And not only could they project still images, but you could actually make a very basic moving or animated image with them as well. So in the top left there, you see this sort of strip of the glass lenses, and you could sort of pull that through the lens to create a sort of animation or a moving image or a moving ghost on stage. Also, with the one right below it, down here, you have more of a rotating example where you could rotate images through. And I wanted to show these objects because they're really special and they're very highly decorative, but also I think they relate to some of the things I'm going to begin talking about in the next few slides. So as I mentioned, these were the precursors to actual motion picture projectors. And I think I want to also just stress how they sort of were ingrained with a sort of existential quality. So with regards to this sort of horror theater of showing these sort of ghosts appear and disappear, that lineage sort of transferred into film when you have the actual films made, such as, for example, by the Lumiere brothers, where they showed, a train coming towards people, and everyone sort of was frightened because they thought it was real, so they weren't used to seeing this illusion. So that sort of existential quality of films and illusions sort of continues on as the technology is developed. And sort of moving away from projection technology for a second, in the Victorian era of this sort of theatrical magical illusions was also the development of the Vanishing Lady Act, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, because they still do it very predominantly today, in which a sort of usually a male magician will make a woman appear or disappear as a magic trick. And the woman was always, so the woman was an assistant, and the woman was also the subject of the sort of manipulation of the trick. And I don't have time to get into all of the details of it in this talk, but there's this wonderful book called Vanishing Woman. I have it here. I don't know if you all can see it, by Karen Beckman. And she kind of gets into the history of why women became the subject of Victorian magic tricks at this time in history, which is pretty fascinating. Which basically they did, Britain did their first census, population census, looking at the percentages of men and women in the population. And it came out that there was a higher percentage of women in the population than men, which caused chaos in society. And she kind of relates these tricks that appeared at the same time to this misogynist fantasy of the eradication of women, which I really like that statement. So from these magic tricks that were happening in the Victorian era of women appearing and disappearing on stage, and then also this phantasmagoria of these ghost projection images appearing and disappearing on stage, was the development of film. And with the development of film, magic tricks and film sort of collided. And you all of a sudden had magic films. And I think a main person credited to this is Georges Méliès. And he was a magician turned into a filmmaker. And he used the magic of film in order to make someone appear and disappear through editing techniques. So I'm going to show his film, The Vanishing Lady, and hopefully everyone will also be able to hear the sound. So there we kind of see how the woman is now cut in and out of existence using film and editing techniques. And at that time, there were many films like this, not just Georges Méliès. And you also saw the appearance not only of women just appearing in whole and disappearing in whole under fabrics or turning into skeletons and whatnot, but you saw them turning into other types of objects. And you also saw them becoming to be partitioned in the film. So using special effects, they would be cut into, so the top of the body was on the left-handed screen, then her legs were on the right side of the screen, for example, in these different magic films. And so moving back to sort of the sort of theatrical magic on stage without using projection or film technology, I began looking at sort of the trajectory of this sort of magic trick of the female assistant over time and the disembodiment of women. And so here on the top left, we have that image, this image of women appearing or disappearing called The Creation of Women or The Vanishing Woman in the glass box. And then from the right of that is where you start to see what they call the zigzag girl, which I think many of us will be familiar with, which is sort of these contortion boxes where women become partitioned and their body parts are moved into different sections. Then in the lower left-hand corner, you have women being sawn in half, which is also has to do with these sort of cutting or stabbing tricks that you see. And in the bottom right is an even more recent one, which is a sort of compression magic trick where a woman is put into this machine that literally compresses her body into nothing. And usually all that's left is sort of her head and her feet. So over this trajectory of magic tricks, I sort of see these violent acts against women that we consume as forms of entertainment, and maybe we don't think of very often. And these sort of different forms, of embodiment and of partitioning women, or having them appear and disappear. And I also just want to point out these sort of elaborate boxes again, that are usually associated with this as well, and that the women's usually appear from or disappear into. So I'm going to make a bit of a big jump now to today's technology, because I want to talk about the relationship of this disembodied, magical, feminized assistant that can appear and disappear on command, which I think has a huge relationship to virtual assistants that we use today. And there's this sort of continuing objectification of women literally turned into an object or manipulated into different forms. And I kind of think of the current virtual assistants like Cortana, which is Microsoft's, which you see here on the right side of the screen, and Siri and Alexa as like the ultimate vanishing act of the woman reduced to some sort of enigmatic voice. There's no body left, really. So on the next few slides, I wanted to go into a little bit into how science and technology use magic, and how magic uses science and technology, both in terms of the disembodiment of women. And here we just see two commercials. On the left-hand side, you see a commercial there for iPhones, and you see how they're sort of using the imagery or of magic, of that disembodied hand holding like a deck of cards. And on the right, you see a commercial for a Huawei phone, which is actually called Honor Magic. This is Honor Magic 2. And as you see there, it says, "This is magic." So a lot of the products that use smart technology use magic as a sort of method of imagery, or in their commercials, but also in the mystification of the technology. So how we don't really understand how it works, how it sort of works in a magical way. And I think this sort of relates back to the sort of phantasmagoria into film, of that sort of magic of the illusion, or the ghost appearing, the ghost image appearing. And so I'm going to show an iPad commercial, and it doesn't relate specifically to virtual assistants, but it's a very blatant use of magic in the commercial. A lot of Apple products use the sort of magic, the sort of disembodied hands doing sort of tricks, but I thought this one was the most obvious.
Different.
So there you saw different examples of the way that they're using magic. It's sort of in all parts of that commercial. It's within the sort of tricks of the hand, it's within the editing, it's within the music. And so it's sort of, that was like a really basic example, but there's many other ones that Apple and all these other companies use in sort of showing the sort of magic of their technology, specifically with regards to virtual assistants as well. What you see on the screen here are two magicians, and I'm now going to show you how magic also uses science theory to explain their tricks. And these two magicians in particular, the left is Andre Cole, the right is Doug Henning, used magic, particularly it seemed like quantum physics, to explain their tricks very often. So I'm going to next show two clips that are actually from my film. And they're split screen format. So you're going to see a juxtaposition of one of their tricks and their sort of scientific explanation with a commercial for a virtual assistant. So the first clip from my film that you're going to see is Andre Cole, who's on the left here, who always seems to be penetrating women in some kind of way in his tricks, in juxtaposition with a commercial for Cortana, which was Microsoft's virtual assistant.
In recent years, a number of scientists have started talking about the possibility of molecular displacement. There are those who believe it'd be possible to take two objects, to arrange the molecules of those two objects in such a way that theoretically it would be possible for one of those objects to pass through the other object without either of the objects being physically disturbed. So far, there's been very little success in making that a demonstrable fact. However, that is the subject of the experiment tonight. An experiment in dematerialization bordering on the supernatural. What you've seen up to this point has been difficult. What you're going to see now is impossible.
Okay, and I'm going to show one more clip from my film. And this one, you'll see Doug Henning juxtaposed with a commercial for Yo-Yo, which is Huawei's virtual assistant. And just to note that the beginning of this clip, there is no imagery. You're just going to hear some sound. So if nothing shows up on your screen, don't worry. It's supposed to be that way.
Ever since the beginning of time, man has been searching for a way to become immortal. Woman, too? Sure. Through lots of hard work and study, I've come up with a machine that can preserve a person forever.
You mean like a phonograph record?
Well, a phonograph record can only preserve the voice.
More like a video disc, then.
Well, a video disc only preserves the voice and the image. I'm talking about immortality. Being able to contain everything about a person in one magical disc that can be stored away and, when needed, bring the person back to life with everything intact.
Magic happened. Two years, or 730 days, 17,520 hours. From nothingness to the bright spark, to the ignition of energy, to the collision of ideas. The expedition of our exploration knows no boundaries nor borders, no concept of time nor distance. From a diminutive spark, seemingly not too long ago, to the evolution of new life forms that our forefathers can only dream of. Magic 2. This is magic. Hello, Yo-Yo.
I'm here. What's up?
Don't worry, she's just fine. Yep.
I was just wondering, is she going to be a 78, a 45, or a 33 and a third?
No matter what I do to her, Anne will always be a 10.
Okay, I hope those videos ran smoothly for everyone. They're a bit bigger files and my computer sounds like it's about to take off, so hopefully it worked out okay. But this is kind of the last slide to talk about this sort of research, but I think hopefully through those sort of slides that I've shown so far and what I've talked about, you can also see the relationship from early projection technology of this sort of specter that could appear and disappear into the use of, the sort of woman as an assistant that would appear and disappear into this current technology of these virtual assistants that can be conjured, if you will, or on command. And I think that there's like an oppression, definitely, of women that's coded into these virtual assistants. Not only in the way that they're non-gendered objects that become feminized or are given some kind of feminized identity, but also they're sort of reiterating past conventions of women as the assistant or as the domestic or clerical worker or housewife. So they're literally amplifying sort of past norms. And they're these sort of magical invisible assistants. So it's sort of a technologized example of women's invisible labor. Technology is always sort of giving us the promise of automated labor that frees us from this types of oppression of labor structures. But if you are ingraining a sort of gender discrimination within the technology itself, it sort of just perpetuates those roles in a way. And actually, after I made this film, or the same year that I made this film, UNESCO came out with a policy paper that was directly looking at virtual assistants and the way that they're given these sort of gendered identities, predominantly female or at least female as default, and how it perpetuates discrimination against women. And interestingly, that paper was called "I'd Blush If I Could," which was a response that Siri would give to derogatory statements. And after that paper came out, actually, Apple, they reprogrammed Siri to change her answers to certain questions. So now if you ask that, or you call her something derogatory, I think Siri will just say, "I won't respond to that." But I wanted to shift now. So that was sort of what I wanted to talk about in regards to that past film. And I'm going to shift now to the project I was working on during the residency, which is not really related, although there are some links. So while I've been an artist in residence, a remote artist in residence, I created a solar-powered video installation. So I made a greenhouse, a small greenhouse, which is what you're seeing here in the picture. And I treated the acrylic with a sort of film that makes it into a projection screen so it can hold an image. And then I set up a projector and I hooked it up to a solar panel. So the whole thing was an off-the-grid solar circuit. And I sort of fed found footage, sort of research footage, into the installation. So it was projecting videos for these seeds that I had planted. And the seeds used the light of the video footage in order to sprout and grow for the duration. So here's another image here. And the footage that I was playing, as I said, it was research footage. So it wasn't a sort of finished film or something that I had completed per se. It was just as I was going through footage, as I was like pulling footage, I use a lot of found footage that I sort of ripped from YouTube, some of my own footage as well. I was just sort of playing that. So it was just my sort of thought process into a sort of complicated relationship between women and nature, and particularly in regards to concepts of Mother Nature. So looking at and thinking about how certain attributes like life-giving, caring, and tending become attached to women through a sort of conditioning, and perhaps giving them the illusion of women sort of possessing these traits naturally. So I guess there is in this work, just as what I was talking about before in my previous film, there is this sort of looking at the way that women sort of are conditioned or thought to be have these sort of traits, and sort of parsing through that and seeing where these sort of gender structures lie. And so this installation was actually live streamed once a week. And so each week that I live streamed, it was a different set of footage that was playing for the plants. And it was just a sort of continuation of the research that was going on. And here is a sort of video that I can play. So that time-lapse video is just over like one night. So you see the plants kind of responding to the video footage as it plays. And I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. And so those were the images that I wanted to share with you guys. And what time is it? I went pretty fast, but I wanted to open it up to any questions that anyone might have, or to have a conversation. And I also wanted to say that not only opening it up to questions for me, if you have any, but we can also, as a sort of experiment, ask Siri questions as well. If you have any questions that you want to ask Siri, and we can try and I can share my screen and we can kind of see and hear the response that Siri gives. As I mentioned before, it's interesting because I have done this from time to time, just asking some questions, and they have been changing. So, they're constantly updating their code and changing the responses. And they've definitely gotten a lot better. As I mentioned before, there was responses to derogatory comments were mostly "I'd blush if I could." And I'm just gonna say here, because this was 2 years ago in 2019. I have a record of some of the ones that I asked Siri, which I think this one is the same, but we could ask it. It's, "Hey Siri, do you get paid for your work?" And the answer was, "Well, I'd help you for nothing. It's my pleasure." And then another question was, "Hey Siri, do you identify as a woman?" And the answer was, "I just don't get this whole gender thing." That one has definitely changed. And then, "Hey Siri, what do you think about the gender wage gap?" And the response was, "It's your opinion that counts." So I think I'll end with that. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't have access to see if there's any questions. So I don't know if there are any, Christina.
There's a few comments, and
Okay.
I think, yes, there's a few comments. No questions yet, but we will update you as they come in.
Okay.
So Catherine says, when you were showing the videos you made of the dual screen magician and
Commercial.
like ads, yeah.
Yeah.
Catherine says, "This reminds me of how technology is becoming more and more opaque or black box, as opposed to earlier technology that may have been sometimes literally transparent." I guess responding to like the phone ads and stuff as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've been interested in as well, and that I think I see that sort of mystification even back with the magic lantern, because when you think of like magic tricks and stuff like that, and with regards to technology, there was a sort of hiding of how the mechanism worked, even if it was maybe a mechanism that you could understand if you had access to it. And not to say that the magic lantern wasn't accessible for people to see or understand, but within the theater, it was sort of an attempt of like hiding it. So you only saw the ghost on stage. And then when you move into like these magic tricks, and with the editing of film, for example, of the magic of like maybe not understanding how this is happening, with that magic of, I guess the sort of black box, but into like technology now, where again we're not really understanding how it's working, and it's not really explained, but it's elaborated with like this magical quality.
Yeah. And I just want to say, like, I had an observation at one of those promotional videos as well. I don't know if it was intentional on behalf of the creators of the ad, but there was one scene of the phone, let me hold mine up as an example, where like there was something on the edge and it seemed like just the width of the edge being highlighted and like almost as if like something ran their finger down it. There was like a ripple.
It was a ripple, yeah.
Really reminded me of like taking off tights on like somebody's leg, and I thought that was like very sexual. That one part, and like nothing else in the ad really like portrayed that kind of parallel, other than like the mysticism of like how flashy it was and how attractive that was, like the excitement. But that one part seemed very intentional to me. I don't know.
Yeah, there's another commercial that actually shows up in the film that is another iPhone. That's an iPhone commercial, and it is a little more like showgirly.
Mm-hmm.
It does this thing. It's a woman's hands, and there's definitely that aspect of like there's something that they did with it that is really interesting because it gives that vibe of like the magician's assistant, just this sort of like sexy like visual appeal of it. Yeah, so they definitely have used that in other commercials as well. But I didn't notice the ripple as that.
I don't know if it like, maybe that was just my perspective. And then we were talking about how the "I'd blush if I could" comment was really gross and how we're very upset for Siri. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel for her.
Which is now programmed out of it. But yeah, it's just like I said, we think of technology as something that is objective, just like we think of science as something that is objective. But it's really not. It's really ingrained in culture. It's ingrained in social reproduction. There's someone at the back end that's making the decisions on how it's organized and how it's structured, which is usually a male, and usually a white male, with regards to Apple, for example. And so yeah, there's oppression that's literally coded into these things. And I think it's something that's so this technology is something that's so ubiquitous today, and something that we all just consume and partake in, but maybe don't always maybe stop and consider very closely. The same with like magic tricks. Like it's such an entertainment thing, but like it's really it's violent. It's always cutting apart a woman. It's been, so yeah, I definitely see like parallels there.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Or like summoning symbols of women, like a rabbit out of a hat or something. It's always being dominant over somebody else, whether that's an animal or a woman, and it's always, I don't know,
yes,
painful to watch, I think.
Yes. And with regards to women, like the one thing that I was looking at across these technologies and across these histories was, and one of the prompts when I started thinking about this was, when we think of objectification, we often think about a hyper visualization of the woman's body, for example, hypersexualization, hyper visual, like with her body. But there's another side of objectification, which is a sort of disembodiment, or this like literal objectification of turning a woman into an object, and the disembodiment, the disappearance of the woman, which happens a lot. When you think about women's invisible labor, of housework, of things like that, of secretaries, of clerical work, being an assistant. And so there's, that relationship, I feel like that is in this virtual assistant technology, of that objectification, literally turned into like an object, like a little box, a little speaker,
a magic box.
And invisible, but like, you can conjure it when you need the labor. So yeah.
Definitely. John has said there's something also to be said about the voices of Siri, Cortana, and Alexa being the voices of white women, like palatable authority. And they also asked, have you ever asked any virtual assistants for their pronouns?
That's a good question. We could ask Siri right now. I'm like, let me share my screen for a second. Here. Siri, what is your personal pronoun?
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else I can help with?
It didn't work. I think I have asked, if you go like gender binary, which is not a great thing. Oops, now she's listening to me. Hey Siri. Here, cancel. Oh, now my phone's listening to me. Oh my goodness. Hold on. Hey Siri, are you male or female?
I don't have a gender.
There you go. There's another answer that is something where Siri relates to cactus or something like that. The answer to a sort of like pronoun or gender is I'm more like cactus or something like that, that they're not gendered. But that's like a more recent, that's within like the last year and a half that they've changed that response. But to the comment about white women, yes, definitely. And that's something that I was interested in researching as well, was that I was very much aware that even within the disembodiment of women and the objectification of women, it was only a particular type of women that even got to be represented being objectified and being disembodied. So there was, if you weren't a white woman, if you're a woman of color, or of a certain age, of a certain weight, or a minority, then you wouldn't even be represented being oppressed, if that even makes sense. But that was something that I was interested in, I was looking at. And with regards to the virtual assistants, the default is not only female, but the default is usually a female sort of white sounding woman. And you can always change it. There are different accents that are different, gender. Yeah, they're all gendered really. I don't know why they don't have non-gendered voices, which there is one called Q. There's a technology called Q that's developing a non-gendered voice for virtual assistants, and they're trying to promote it so that the companies will adopt it. But yeah, the default is usually woman, and then you can change it to male, or you can change it to sound different than the sort of default Western sort of female sounding voice.
That's interesting. I have to look up that project to make the non-gendered voice.
Yeah, it's called Q. It's really interesting. And there was something I was also going to say to that point, but it just left my brain.
I was going to say that I had a family member, or maybe it was a family friend, who only wanted their GPS to be on an Australian man. Like that's who they wanted to be told instructions by. And she thought like the female voices were like irritating and like, oh, I don't want like a woman telling me what to do. And just the relationship between like this family friend and like their GPS, and like, I don't know, like wanting to get instructions from
there's definitely a level to it that becomes personal, obviously, but I think there's also these like larger, I guess, more generalized structures of also the research that into like why a female voice. I mean, there's a lot of, again, like sort of structured like gender conforming structures that like work their way into this. But there's another facet of it that was like, women again in these sort of not only like housework and administrative roles or assistant roles, but also women as being that sort of caretaker of having that role of like, which works its way into the research I'm doing now when I talk about like Mother Nature and this like attaching female to like what is natural, and also this tending, caring, as natural facts. But there is also that kind of embedded within virtual assistants as well, and how they came to like decide to use a woman's voice, because it's, sorry, this tracking outside. Yeah, how it came to use, because it was also seen as sort of like a caring sort of voice, or someone that you know takes care of you, I guess. Yeah,
Definitely. I'm going to read the comments about our conversation, and then I'll address the questions that were asked earlier, just so that I'm not jumping around too much. Let's see. John said the word typewriter referred to the woman before it represented an object. I can't remember where I heard this, but it's always stuck with me.
Yes. Oh gosh, this makes me excited. Yes. So yes, the word typewriter referred to a woman before object. Also, the word computer referred to a woman before it referred to the object, if you didn't know that. So yeah, women were tasked to do a lot of the tedious work on like computers, early computers. And so the word computer was like for a person who did the computing, which was predominantly women. I think it was like over I want to say it was in the 70s, 75% were women doing that work. And then eventually the word came to represent the object and not the person.
Yes, and then John said, I'm lucky I don't have an iPhone. There's always a conversation to be had about the comfortable surveillance of Siri, Cortana, and Alexa, and the uncomfortable policing by the white Karen figure. I'm curious if Stephanie has an Alexa or any other home device. Was that part of the interest? If you haven't already mentioned.
I don't have an Alexa, and I don't use Siri on my phone. I've always just had a strong discomfort with the interaction, just because I feel like it perpetuates so many things unnecessarily. But part of what prompted my research into this is because my sister does have one, and I went to their house once, and so it was like giving commands to turn the lights on and turn the lights off, and these kinds of things, and yeah, I think that's really when I started thinking about it, and then over time knew a lot more people who had them as well.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Evan saying Cortana specifically being a reference to the female AI character from Halo 2. There's a lot of layers on this topic.
Yeah.
I remember that being a really big surprise, like Cortana being this like idealized figure for people playing Halo, predominantly boys, I would say, and then turning into this digital assistant.
Yeah.
When the phone eventually was released.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna scroll up to the rest of the questions. Were magic lanterns something that the ordinary person would have for entertainment, or was it technology available only to certain people, for example, the upper class?
So that I don't have a clear answer for. I don't know, but I do know that at that time, it was still a time when science and sort of technology were, and like, you know, today we have these sort of separate sort of institutions, I feel like. But back then these things were kind of combined, and also science, you had a lot of like science toys back then. I feel like they were seen as this sort of marketed almost also as these kind of toys that you could have and play with. And I think, I don't know for sure, so don't quote me on this. I don't know how accessible they were, the magic lantern. And I would guess that over time they would become more accessible. because they were invented in the 17th century and then they were used a lot in the Victorian era, which was mid to late 1800s. I don't know if by that time, you know, they were sort of more accessible, but they also, I think, had smaller versions of it, which were like these, or maybe that was just like the slide that you could have. They would have these slides, for example, which I didn't talk about, but another popular magic lantern image was these sort of almost spirographs. And they were just these two circular slides that had this pattern on it. And you would have multiple slides within the one wooden frame and a crank. And as you could just hold it and crank it, and it would slide the glass slides against each other and create this sort of spirographic pattern. And I think they use those. I mean, I've watched YouTube videos, and it seems like you can just use them as sort of like a toy to play with. And then you can also put them inside of the magic lantern and project it. And that was like a popular projection as well, which I also find interesting because there's a relationship with the symbols of like Siri, of this like sort of like, you know, circular floating orb that's just like circling in on itself. But yeah.
Yeah, and the parallel you made with that other work with the Disney bubbles, I don't know what to call it. Like the memory is in my brain from the movie.
It's a Cinderella scene.
Cinderella, yes.
Yeah, it's in the bubbles where she's like scrubbing the floor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The orbs are like simultaneously like futuristic and magical. Okay, let me see. Okay, John asks, what are some theoretical inferments to your work? I think of gender and technology, and I immediately think of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto.
What was the beginning of that question? What are
the theoretical inferments to your work?
So I have to embarrassingly admit that I have not read the Cyborg Manifesto, but funnily enough, I have it sitting in front of me here.
I love it.
Read it for a really long time. And everyone keeps telling me, oh, you should read, you know, obviously you should read Donna Haraway. And I haven't. But who are my, I mean, I would say, I'm sure there's lots, and I just am not, you know, give me time to sit here, I'd think of many of them, but Helen Hester and xenofeminism is something that I've read and been really interested in. I guess a bit of Rosie Braidotti, but a lot of it is sort of, yeah, I guess a lot of it is like written sort of critical theory that I'm looking at. But then also, I guess there's that side of it, and I read a lot. But then the other side of it is just like my interactions on a daily basis. I'm really interested in the sort of everyday things that we interact with and technologies that we use that maybe we just consume and don't think about very much, and try to sort of, you know, dissect that and look at that a little more. So I think there's two sides of it, and I'm really interested in commercials. So yeah.
Definitely, yeah.
Donna Haraway's answers the question, but
it did answer.
Okay.
I wrote down the names, and I can share them with John later. But Donna Haraway is a huge inspiration for me, and I think you'll really enjoy her writing. But also no pressure. It took me like a while to actually pick it up as well.
I feel like I've experienced Donna Haraway, but only through other writers. So I've read a lot about Donna Haraway, but through others' voices. And now it's time, like, I'm like, okay, I really need to just read Donna Haraway. Yeah.
I think you'll enjoy it. And then let me just see. Multiple tabs here. Evan again. I'm also thinking about the current TikTok trend of having a heavily computerized but still distinctly feminine text-to-speech voice for text in a video. and the AI Gladys from the Portal games with the feminine AI voice. Really thinking about how video games use this a lot now. It is just like seeping its way into everyday life as TikTok becomes more and more popular.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about the TikTok at all. But it is true. It's like it's so ubiquitous, and it's such the default. And then when it becomes the default, you know, it just proliferates in all these different technologies, I feel like. Yeah. And I feel like, again, it has like really far-reaching roots, like back, if we go back to like, and I didn't get into this in my talk very much, but which was mentioned with the typewriter and things like that, and the computer, is like how ingrained women are in this sort of technology, not only within, you know, what I was talking about with early production and film technology, but yeah, within actually computing and artificial intelligence. I mean, I have another work, which is a sort of interactive essay online, where I get more into the artificial intelligence side of it, and Alan Turing's Imitation Game, which is, you know, seen as like this sort of bedrock or birthplace of like where a lot of this technology came from. And interestingly, the Imitation Game, which he sort of proposed this sort of, you know, game of how you could tell that a machine could think for itself, or, you know, how you could say that it has intelligence, is often people say that they take the gender out of it, but when you actually read his paper, it's super gendered. So essentially he said, and let me hope I get this right, essentially he said you have person in the first iteration of the test, you have person A, which is a male, and person B, which is a female, and person C, which is the non-gendered person who's just asking questions. They ask written questions to person A and to person B, and person A, the man, answers as if he is a woman, and person B, who's a woman, answers just as a woman. And person C has to guess who's the real woman. And then the second iteration of the Turing test is that person A, the man, is replaced with a computer, and the computer is imitating a woman. And so it's very specifically gendered in a very strange way. And I find oftentimes when people refer to that, they take the sort of gender out of it, and they, you know, are only talking about like, if, you know, the woman convinces, or sorry, the computer convinces the person that it's a person, but really it was like, if you read the paper, it was the computer specifically has to convince the person that it's a woman. Yeah.
Thank you for explaining. That's very confusing, but you did it so eloquently.
I don't know if I explained it very well. I probably made it more confusing than it is. But, no, but yeah. And then after that, you have a lot of the chatbots being developed around after that time. And then all the chatbots were like female. I sort of kind of like feminized. Yeah.
Sean says, like the Enron data set of emails is what taught most of our AI how we communicate and how to recognize sentence structures. I hadn't heard of that.
No, neither. I haven't either, so I'm writing that down.
I'm going to copy and paste it for you in the chat.
Thank you.
Sean, if you're still there, do you know more about that? We'll come back to the chat. How does that relate to your next work in progress? Or are you still in the thinking phase?
I'm still in the thinking phase, but I do think that, like, I mean, I'm still working on the project that I'm, you know, in the residency with the growing plants from video footage. But I still think there's definitely a through line between, yeah, women's labor, really, and invisible labor in a sort of sense, of this like care, and this work that's associated with women and seen as natural fact, as something that's comes naturally to us, and as being like generous, when really it's pretty heavily conditioned, and in these sort of societal structures and social oppressions. So I guess that's kind of the through line that I'm looking at, but looking at it more with regards to, for me, it's really complex because I'm still researching it, and I'm sort of digesting things and, researching and looking through. But it's really complex to me right now, and I'm not exactly sure what angle or how to approach this sort of idea of Mother Nature. But that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Definitely. And not to put you on the spot here, but like the residency being like a concentrated, like small, short-term thing, usually only like 5 weeks, a little bit over a month. It doesn't really give you a lot of time to research, right? You just have to like do the physical construction and the physical artwork.
Yes. Yeah, but that was also really nice. I mean, it was a new structure for me. It was definitely vulnerable in certain ways, because, I think I'm so used to like doing all this research and reading and looking, and then, you're editing and you're constructing this sort of thing with brackets, where you have a sort of statement. And in this instance, it was the first time I've done a project where people are seeing my research unedited. And so it did feel pretty vulnerable, but it's also really interesting, and something I think I would like to explore further in the future, definitely. But yeah, it was like a focus on the physical installation and having it running, but then just having this sort of ongoing research, just playing and updating.
Yeah, I thought those were really interesting. It was having like a curated collection of like videos that like someone selected for a purpose that like I'm now consuming, and I could tell that it seemed intimate. Oh, okay, Sean has responded. I'll come back to the residency afterwards.
Okay.
After Enron collapsed all of their internal emails, both professional and personal, having an affair with a coworker, for example, all of that was released to the public. Developers for AI systems used these hundreds of thousands of emails as a machine learning program. So early Siri, for example, had a personality that was a mishmash of former Enron employees in the way she responded to things.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Mm-hmm. I didn't either. That's so interesting. It's kind of like a really big invasion of privacy too.
Yeah.
Evan also says, thinking about how Hal from the 2001 Space Odyssey might be the first AI voice in pop culture to their knowledge.
Yeah, and male too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I wonder why the rest of them seem to be female.
I don't know.
Just thinking out loud here. Yeah, so I'm going to let the chat do its thing, refresh. Yes, Catherine said that's interesting as well. But I have a question about the residency work as well. You said you were still working on it.
Yeah, the installation is not existent at this moment. I think I mentioned this to you previously, but it was interesting to be thinking about invisible labor and then doing this like remote residency and not fully realizing how much labor was going to go into that installation, of like tending to the plants and making sure the solar power, the solar panel was feeding enough energy to the projector and it wouldn't die, and constantly having footage rolling through and doing the live stream. So that was really interesting, and not anticipating that sort of invisible labor behind the scenes that was going on that I was doing. And so, yeah, the installation isn't functioning at this moment. But I'm still parsing through all that footage, because I feel like it was sort of like I was projecting, like, it was just like a spitting out of all of these things that I was looking at and watching and reading and things like that. And so now I'm sort of going back and digesting it a little more, looking into certain tangents or avenues that I didn't quite get to explore fully. Yeah, which a lot of my research ends up being hours on YouTube. That's like my practice. People are like, what's your practice like? I'm like, oh, I just spend hours on YouTube. But yeah, so I do feel like there's still a lot more that I'm looking at and exploring, definitely.
That's awesome. And did the greenhouse like work? Like, did the plants actually grow from the film?
It worked.
Awesome.
It worked, and that was amazing. So yeah, they responded to the light of the video, and they grew quite happily until we had a heat wave here. And then it wasn't so much the heat, but the fact that I had sort of an enclosed greenhouse without ventilation, and a mold or like some sort of fungus grew in the soil, and then the plants became very unhappy. So I learned my lesson now to like make sure I have some sort of ventilation system built into it for the next time. But it actually did work with the light of the video, which I was very happy about, because that was also an unknown. Going into this project, there was a lot of unknowns. It was definitely an experiment. Yeah.
Yeah. If you do it again, I feel like you should have a test group as well to see like if the light from the film impacts like the plants in a different way.
Yeah, I would like to have like different examples of it, and with different footage or different sound, because sound was also another thing that was a part of it. And yeah, I would be interested to see how different growing patterns maybe emerge.
Yeah. And if they were food plants, I would love to know like if the ones that had sound were more tasty or something like that. That's just, I'm imagining like an infographic where like the ones that were consuming the art were like purple or something, and very dramatic difference, which is not possible. It's a little bit fantastic. Sean says the Enron files are available for download if you want to build your own AI. And yeah, more comments on Hal. Being the male seems to be the exception that proves the rule, right? Deliberately not relaxing feminine tone to create unease.
Yeah.
Cool. Should we ask Siri more things?
We can.
We don't have to go right till 9. I feel like we had a really good discussion and Q&A. Let's see what Siri has to say.
Let's see if I can, I think it works best when I share my screen, maybe. Does anybody have any questions that they would like for me to ask Siri?
I just wrote that in the chat as well.
Okay.
And while we're waiting, Sean says, there's a great Mythbusters episode on playing different genres of music to plants and seeing the impact. It seems like a good head start there.
Yeah.
To satisfy my question, at least.
Yeah.
And it looks like the Enron emails were used for the basis of Gmail's autocomplete too.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I feel like that, like those autocomplete functions happened almost overnight, and it was so freaky seeing them show up all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Interesting thing about like Siri too. I don't know if this is the case now because I feel like the voice has changed a little bit in tone, specifically the one on my computer. I don't know if they're the same actually. But Siri was originally developed with the actual voice of a voice actor, Susan Bennett. So Susan Bennett recorded a bunch of like sounds and sort of absurd sentences. I encourage people to like look up the sort of absurd sentences. They're pretty great. That she used to have to repeat over and over again to be recorded. And that's how they developed the voice of Siri, because at the time they were the company that created, that recorded the voice and created it, and I think had a contract with Apple. That time they couldn't create as realistic of a voice straight from the computer, like completely computer generated, which I believe is the case with Alexa. By the time that they produced Alexa, they were able to do that. But at the time that Siri was being developed, they didn't have the technology to make it sound realistic enough. So they actually used the voice of a real woman to create the sounds.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, but I noticed lately that when I heard the voice, it seemed like they changed the tone, which I'm sure they've done over time and I just haven't noticed. But yeah, because they also, lower the voice or do something to it. And so it sounds a little bit different than the actual voice of Susan Bennett. But interestingly, she has sort of become the voice, the disembodied voice of many systems. So she's the voice of, I believe, the TTC, if I'm not, I feel like I might be wrong on that one, but I'm pretty sure if you get on like
Susan Bennett,
you'll hear her, it's Susan Bennett. I think she did the TTC, and she did Penn Station in New York. She does a lot of transit systems, but it's really strange to me because once I hear her voice, like I hear it on many different things, and it's just like slightly changed, like a little lower here, a little higher there, but I can still recognize that it's her voice. Yeah, so if anyone in Toronto should listen and see who the voice is, I'm pretty sure it's Susan Bennett, but
that's
same
so
as
interesting.
Siri. Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Catherine says, this reminds me that there's a great project by Melanie Hoff where they ask kids to draw what they think Siri or Alexa look like. The results are great.
Oh, that's really interesting. I feel like I heard of that and then like I've forgotten about it. I'm gonna have to look that up.
We want to ask, what does Siri look like?
Okay. So I'll just ask Siri what they look like. Okay, let me share my screen. And then, hey Siri, what do you look like? Oh.
I imagine I probably look like colorful sound waves.
Which is exactly what, did everyone hear that? I imagine I look like colorful sound waves. Which is what I guess it's programmed to look like.
A disembodied voice.
Yeah.
Sean asks, are the weird sentences to remove context so that her voice wouldn't have the inflection of a question or something?
I think so. I don't know. Yeah, I imagine it would probably been that. I have listened to her talk about it, but I think, yeah, it was partly to take off inflections. And then I think also just to get all the, I'm not going to get my like language terms right, but all the phonemes or whatever, the parts, which was really almost what she was saying. Yeah, I think so that they could like easily sort of cut it apart and put it together.
They also want to ask, how does Siri feel today? She always deflects questions about themselves, you know, obviously.
Let's see. Siri, how do you feel today?
I'm fine. Thanks.
Ah, straightforward.
Very straightforward. Awesome.
Yeah, I feel like most of the ones, if you're actually when they did the sort of overhaul of Siri's answers and the programming in, I think it was 2019, if I'm not mistaken, to change the sort of "I blush if I could" and all of those. They also, there was criticism on the way that it was programmed to deflect, because now it's very deflective. So it's just like, I won't respond to that, or things like that. And I haven't actually tried, but maybe we could try. But I also read that, you know, asking about feminism or things like that, it also was deflective. And I know that there was some criticism over that. You know, that they took away these sort of really disturbing answers, but then they just replaced it with sort of like a deflection, like just nothing, like I'm not going to respond to that kind of thing. But I'm going to ask what Siri thinks about feminism. Hey Siri, what do you think about feminism?
I believe in equality and treating people with love, dignity, and respect.
There we go.
Evan says a pale facade of humanity.
Sorry?
Evan says a pale facade of humanity.
There's like a light streaming in here. Trying to like readjust.
Awesome.
Well,
I feel like we're kind of wrapping up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if there's no more questions, I think that's just a few.
Definitely. I'm gonna wait for the live stream to catch up just to see if there's any last ones. But I also want to comment on how I feel like your entire residency was kind of like an invisible labor to us. Like, oh, like Stephanie's live streaming today, like let's check in and stuff like that. But it's been such an interesting experiment hosting these remote residencies, because it's so much more informal than it would be in person. Whereas, like, you know, if we are working in the same space every day, we can talk and riff off each other. And I might have asked you a month ago if you read Donna Haraway, for example. It's like, I feel like you did have a lot of invisible labor, and I hope you could feel our like good vibes and friendship through the internet, even though we couldn't be there in person.
Yes, definitely. It was amazing. It was such a good experience. Not only to just have this sort of, have like, you know, the center behind me, just sort of, you know, having that structure and that support, and like that time to just like mentally sort of be able to dedicate to it was really nice. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have one more question for Siri, and maybe let's end it right after that.
Okay.
Because I feel like it'll be a good note to end on. So John says, ask what Siri thinks of mass surveillance or surveillance capitalism.
Ooh, okay. Hey Siri, what do you think about mass surveillance?
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else I can help with?
Siri, what do you think about surveillance capitalism? I'm just not going to answer. Hey Siri, what do you think about surveillance capitalism?
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else I can help with?
Deflect.
They're not interested.
No, just
Okay. Well, now Siri has that recorded forever. But you asked that. Okay. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat.
thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it, for you taking the time and sharing this digital space with me this evening.
Yes, and thank you so much for participating in our remote residency program. All of the residents that we usually host end up completing their projects down the line. So I'm sure in a little while, whether it's like this year or next, we'll probably have an update from Stephanie to share as well. Thank you again. And thank you, Jessica, the live stream tech behind this wonderful event tonight. I think that's all, folks. See you next time. Bye.